with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. And then we also have Jeff Beal, who is a biologist with Ducks Unlimited, and they're going to tell us about the MK Ranch restoration. So, Kathy, you ready to take it away?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, so I actually work on the Apalachicola River Wildlife and Environmental Area. I've been there for about 7.5 years. So over that time, you know, we've kind of developed this idea, and luckily it's all come together into this big project that Ducks Unlimited is now handling and managing for us. And actually that's a little picture of the M&K Ranch. I think it was last April when I took that picture during a secretive marsh bird survey that we do down there. And just in the foreground, you can see, can you all see my arrow cursor, or do I have to do something special to like point things out on this presentation?
Yeah, that works great for pointing things out.
Okay, so this is one of the canals that Jeff will be talking about more in detail and we'll be discussing, but just so you get an idea, this is some of the work that will be done is kind of eliminating some of these canals that are interrupting hydrologic flow. And it's pretty wide. There's a lot of big canals. It's probably 15 or 20 feet, that one. All right, so what I'm gonna do before Jeff gets into talking more about the whole project, I'm just gonna put this area into context. And I think I have to begin this better. Let's see. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what I've done that's not wanting to, because you guys just see the first slide, correct? Trying to read.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what I did with, let me try to restart it because I think I shut the, unless I can just advance it. Oh, I don't know what I did. I apologize. We had this all worked out, but then I've done something where it's not wanting to show the not wanting to advance. Oh, maybe I can just do it this way. All right, that works. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. All right, so here's the context. I took this map from ANERR's Roadmap to Recreation, which is a pretty awesome resource for visitors. Here is the Apalachicola River Wildlife and Environmental Area along the lower reaches of the Apalachicola going into the bay. It's surrounded by a lot of public land. I've got a list up here from that Roadmap to Recreation of all the various public lands, state and federal. There's 500,000 acres of the national forest, 200,000 some of Tate's Hell, and then the Apalachicola River together with the lead parks that are from FWC and the co-op areas. It's about 100,000 acres. So, and that's not including all the other acreage from Boxar, the state parks, the national wildlife refuges. So it's part of a pretty big complex of protected lands. Specifically, the Apalachicola River WEA covers Gulf and Franklin counties. And as I said, it's getting close to 99,000 acres with the cooperatively managed lands. Up here, this is Northwest Florida Water Management District lead area, but FWC co-leads. And same thing with the darker kind of green down here. This is DEP, but it's also established into the WEA. The main portion here in this kind of olive green color is all FWC lead area. So that's about 78,000 acres. And its main purpose is to protect the floodplain of the lower Apalachicola River. The acquisition history of this property is the main section was purchased in 1974 as part of the Environmentally Endangered Lands program within the state, and that was majority just the floodplain buffering the river itself. We added some more to the west in 1985, and you'll see in this slide or two that this includes the M&K Ranch portion. On the other side, on the east side of the river, we acquired a lot of uplands here in the 90s that used to be pine plantation and turpentine production and some cattle production in the early 1900s. And our last big acquisition was actually in 2019, where the state was able to acquire the Wimico tract with the help of the Nature Conservancy, who bought it and then donated it to the state. So the Apalachicola River WEA's portion is this that's north of Lake Wimico. That's about 14,000 acres, but the whole tract, it includes this pink section south of the lake, and that was established into Boxar. So this 6,000 acres about down here of Wimico plus our 14,000, it was about a 20,000 acre acquisition altogether, and half was, well, 2/3 were put into Arwea and 1/3 was put into Boxar, and then this is the rest of Boxar that already existed. So as you can see, we've got a pretty nice buffer now all around that lake. It's a 4,000 acre lake, and it's going to just be completely undeveloped and protected as part of the WMA system of FWC. So we are all very excited to get that. And then we have a little piece up here that we acquired in September of 2020. It's about 600 acres just to the north of our existing area over in Gulf County. So here's where the M&K Ranch part is situated in the midst of all this. So it's about 6,300 acres, and it's just on the west side of the Apalachicola River. So now you kind of see how it's laid out, but what is there on the ground? So the main takeaway from this is here's the Apalachicola River. All this blue is floodplain swamp. These are our upland areas that were primarily pine plantation and turpentine and cattle before the state purchased it, as was this up here. This was a little bit more heavily into the ag scene than this over here. And then here in the M&K Ranch, it's floodplain swamp. And then this is a little bit of marsh. We have some freshwater marsh and some saltwater marsh down in the area just north of the bridge that goes between East Point and Apalachicola. So we work on a lot of upland restoration in these eastern pieces and some in this Gulf County portion. So some of the techniques that we use, I'm just going to provide a little more context as to what we do on the area with the upland restoration before I start talking about hydrology. So primarily we use mechanical treatments. Oh, and I should have mentioned our main habitats, let me go back real quick. Our main upland habitats that we're focused on are the flatwoods and the wet prairies. So we're trying to transform some of these from the pine plantations of the past back into wiregrass type flatwoods communities and planting longleaf pine where appropriate. And then also wet prairie communities, which are typically way less, have way fewer trees, you know, scattered trees, but it's mostly, you know, herbaceous understory. And that's true for the flatwoods too. It's just there's more tree density there. And so to achieve these restoration goals, we use mechanical treatments in combination with prescribed fire lot, because as you can see here, this is one of my supervisor, and he's over 6 feet tall, and this was a wet prairie site back in 2006. And so, you know, you've got pretty dense shrub cover, nothing really resembling a prairie. And the fine fuels there were very limited. So getting a successful prescribed fire to burn across this 60 acres was not successful. They tried multiple times, and finally they brought in a machine to mow it. And over repeated treatments of mowing and burning, now we're finally getting back to what a wet prairie might look like. This was in 2015. We've since applied another prescribed fire on that area and hope to do so again this spring. But now we're back to much more herbaceous cover, less shrubs, and you know, we're getting to see some rare plants that might have been suppressed before. So We're pretty happy with that. Other things that we do in the flatwoods, we also use prescribed fire and mechanical treatments where we need to. The goal is to get all these communities back to just being fire maintained only. We also will apply prescribed fire in marshes. Now the return interval, that is the time span between when you would want to conduct your fires, the number of years apart. It's a longer period of time for the marshes, but we still do ignite these maybe every 5 to 7 years, and that helps to burn up some of that thatch and material that makes it hard for resident birds like rails, say, to move through the grasses successfully. There's also another big study going on with NOAA and partners across the Gulf states to try to get a better understanding of fire's role in these marsh ecosystems. There's just another picture of lighting a marsh on fire. And here is the M&K Ranch site. We were able to burn this. It's mostly a freshwater marsh. We were able to burn this last February. And then this is what it looked like 2 months later. And here's another little piece that will become relevant more as Jeff talks. This is one of the levees. So there we have canals and levees across this marsh that M&K, the company M&K, put in there back in the 70s. And so this is another piece that's interrupting the historic flow across the area of water. And just a couple more pictures. This is another picture of one of those large canals that are going to try to be addressed during this restoration project. Some of the birds, limpkin, and I'm pretty sure that's a solitary sandpiper, but I'm not great with shorebirds. So I saw those two characters down there again when I was doing a secretive marsh bird survey. And other restoration techniques we use in the uplands, we've got ground cover restoration for some of those former ag fields in Gulf County. And here are some of my coworkers who are loading a planter with some native seed that was collected at the National Forest. And we also conduct a lot of invasive plant control, primarily climbing fern, but we do have water hyacinth and a few others, Kogan grass patches here and there that we can seek and destroy. So we try to stay on top of those as well. And finally, we do some timber management. Again, I mentioned that especially on the east side of the river, there was a lot of timber and pine plantation, slash pine, planted by the companies back in the 90s and the 80s. So we have a plan to periodically thin those when they get to be appropriately sized. And then in the right habitats, we will underplant longleaf pine to get back to that flat woods type community. Well, we do all this restoration work, but we also try to monitor the results of that through both wildlife and vegetation monitoring. So we conduct a lot of surveys throughout the year, trying to understand how the wildlife is responding to what we're doing management-wise. We look for certain game species. We have wild turkey, we look at northern bobwhite presence, and we have some of our listed species like the red cockaded woodpecker and the Barber's map turtle in the river. Then we do keep track of common wildlife as well. We do point counts for breeding songbirds, and we have a bird banding station where we try to understand our area's role in survival of adults and recruitment of juvenile birds over the years. And like I said, we also look at vegetation response. Our agency has a program called Objective-Based Vegetation Monitoring, and that the people involved in that go out every 5 years to our fire maintained communities like the flatwoods and the prairies, and they have points where they will go and measure different vegetation characteristics to see how we're progressing towards the desired future conditions for that particular habitat. And so, for example, in flatwoods, it would be, you know, increased amount of herbaceous cover, reduced amount of shrub cover. There are plenty of other metrics, but that's just an example. And then we do go out and periodically look for rare and listed plants, because I think that helps indicate where you have better ground cover intact, and maybe you can focus on those areas to make that habitat even better. And it gives you clues as where you need to be careful of what kind of treatments you're applying. You know, maybe you don't want to go in there with a roller chopper and chop over some endangered plant. Maybe you don't need that. Maybe you can just achieve whatever next goal you have with fire. So of course, all of these pieces of our area are connected by water. And so another big part of what we do is working towards the hydrologic restoration of the area. And we get a lot of flooding from the Apalachicola River. Usually at some point during each year, some of these low water crossings, which is what I've showed you here, become impassable. And I try to give you a zoomed out view here. This, if you're not familiar with a low water crossing, you find them a lot on our dirt roads, and they'll kind of give you a clue as to that it is a low water crossing. There'll be gravel on both
Kathy?
ends. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. You might want to shut off your webcam. We seem to be having a little bit of trouble every once in a while.
Sure, I'll just
Here.
turn it off. Let's see.
Bandwidth.
Oh, maybe so. Okay, is that better? I mean, now that it's gone? Okay. So there's also usually a staff gauge here that will give you an indication as to how deep this water is. So I zoomed in because the water is almost at the top of this, and that's about 5 feet. So periodically you just get cut off, but it's really important to have this flow to be able to move across the landscape like it would have in the past, before there were roads through the area and ditches on the sides of the roads to drain the woods to make it easier for the timber folks. Of course, now we use them for public access. So, I mean, it's good to have the roads, but you do have to let the water move. And here's a picture of what a low water crossing looks like under construction. So they put down like a landscaping mat and gravel. I don't know the exact specs of it, but it basically makes it passable. As long as the water's not too high, you can drive a vehicle through it because it's a gravel bottom. So across the area, we've installed nearly 300 culverts and low water crossings to facilitate flow. That's these green dots are the culverts, and the orange squares are the low water crossings. And that was according to a hydrologic restoration plan that we had done by the Northwest Florida Water Management District. And then we're also kind of exploring, it was sort of inspired by this M&K restoration project. We have ditches that flow through some of our woods, and I have a picture of this down here. This is a wet prairie restoration area, and this ditch has been present in aerial photography from back in the 50s. And we believe it was probably there to help drain the woods for timber operations around this area. But if this is supposed to be a wet prairie, that's completely interrupting water sheet flow across that landscape. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can maybe reduce the impact of places like this within our woods and restore some hydrologic connectivity. And I mean, it makes it easier for small animals to move about, you know, terrestrial things like flatwood salamanders, if we ever get lucky enough to get some back on our area. So just to refresh the view of where the M&K parcel sits within this framework, I brought this picture back and I added in the rivers and creeks layers just so you can see how many, and that's not even all of them. This is just the major, more obvious creeks and sloughs and rivers. There's all sorts of little tributaries and things that, you know, you could see if you zoomed in farther. But this is what the area used to look like from 1953. You know, very few roads and, you know, just an uninterrupted floodplain landscape. And this is what it looks like today. And I wanted to show the same scale, but it's harder to see the detail of these ditches and canals. So on the next slide, I try to zoom in as much as possible. And this is what the M&K company did back in the 70s. And hopefully you can see this network. It's a pretty regular looking network of canals and levees all up and down this stretch of freshwater marsh and floodplain swamp. And they did this for rice farming. However, they did it without a permit, and they were the recipient, so I'm told, of maybe the highest fine that the US EPA had levied at that time. It was, I think, about $2 million when it was discovered what they had done. And then they were under a federal consent decree to restore hydrologic function in this area by installing ditch plugs and breaching some of the levees, but they did not, you know, go in and fill back in all of the ditches and smooth out the levees that they had created. So there's always been this legacy since then of some interrupted flow. And on the site, particularly down this western line, there is and on the eastern line, there are huge wide canals running north to south, draining whatever flow comes from the river directly into the Jackson River, which is right down here at the southern end. I'll show you better in this picture. This is the Jackson River right here flowing into the Apalachicola, and here comes the Apalachicola down like so. So total, all these large and long canals on both sides are just funneling water directly down to the river without any benefit or with much reduced benefit of filtration from the land. So, you know, over the years, we've talked about trying to restore this area, but because it's so huge, you know, and it seemed so cost prohibitive, or just even from actual doing the project scope, was beyond what FWC would have in-house for a resource. But we did kind of think about exploring the idea back in 2016 and 2017. And so our aquatic habitat and restoration section contracted with an engineering company now known as Wood Engineering to model the flows that are out there now. And they installed loggers, which Jeff will get into more, and collected data for a year and modeled the flow. And what they determined was that historically, the flow from the river came out and headed kind of southwest. And so those canals in place on either side of this property were definitely interrupting the flow, where this water should have been headed more towards Lake Wimico and then come down the Jackson instead of going directly down into the Jackson and into the bay. They came up with several plans that we could try to use for restoration options, but what really was like very fortunate was this acquisition of the Wimico tract in 2019, because when we were discussing the results of their modeling, you know, we didn't have the Wimico property. It was always been out there for years, like, can we get it? Can we not? You know, but we did not want to flood that property when it didn't belong to us. And the decision was made to try to do a more moderate level of restoration. It was Plan B, I believe, I think, in the results of that work that Wood did. And so we were going to go with Plan B, but then, you know, all the circumstances aligned, and the Nature Conservancy came in and was able to purchase the Wimico tract and donate it to us. So now, instead of B, we were trying to maximize our restoration option, going with as much restoration as possible. Which essentially means more canals filled in, more levees smoothed out to get the land level back to more of an even scene, where the way it used to be before all these things were dug and built. And then DU came along, and you know, they're very experienced in these type of large scale multi-year projects, and they were willing to partner with us and manage the project. And so we've signed agreements with them, and we've been working together on this for the past year and a half, maybe now, I think at this point. And so we're still involved, the folks at the Aquatic Habitat and Restoration section and the people that work with me at the Apalachicola River WEA. Right now there's 4 of us. We're short 1 person, but there's 4 of us on the ground in this area. Our office is just to the north of that MK Ranch tract, and so we're there to help them and just facilitate them with access and local knowledge. And the reason that they're able to do this is that they applied for a NIFWIF Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund grant, and they received it. So we're in the design process right now, but I'll let Jeff talk more about that. And I've got my contact information down here if anyone wants to ask me any other questions or needs clarification. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Or Kathy, sorry, I'm reading
Either
your
one,
name.
it doesn't matter.
Okay. Jeff, you ready?
Yes, I
We'll
am.
hold the questions till the end.
That sounds good. All right, can everyone see the first slide okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Wonderful. First of all, greetings from Vero Beach, Florida, and East Central part of the state. And thanks so much to Anita and our hosts at the ANERR, and also for Kathy for giving such a great overview and segue into what I'll be talking about. Again, my name is Jeff Beal. I'm a regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited in Florida, relatively new to DU. In fact, it's a newly created position. Haven't had a regional biologist in Florida before. That hasn't stopped us from working in Florida, however, so I'll give you some details on that in a moment. Right, happy to be with you today. And I thought at first I might want to answer a couple questions that you might have, namely, who is DU and why would they want to be involved in such a project? So I'll give you some quick background there. Ducks Unlimited was created in 1937 as an advocate for waterfowl populations in North America, and very much considered a world leader in wetland conservation. 50 million acres wetlands conserved since 1937. And you can see sort of the mission statement there: conserving and restoring wetlands and associated habitats for the benefits of waterfowl, wildlife, and people. And lots of volunteers involved. We rely very much on a volunteer base for what we do. We fall within the southern region, which is really large. It's a 13-state region. My local office, so to speak, would be Charleston, South Carolina. And it was the staff out of that office, led by Emily Purcell, who were able to get the funds that Kathy mentioned. So lots of legwork that went into getting the funds. I was lucky enough to step on board late last summer to be part of this project, but I get to do the fun part, which is spending the money. That's the easy part. Getting the money is the hard part. In case you're curious, the bulk of the money that comes into DU from donations and grants and so forth is spent for on-the-ground conservation and restoration of wetlands. And this particular project falls nicely within the Southeast Wetlands Initiative created by DU just a few years ago. And the southeast of the US plays a big role in waterfowl populations, and particularly in the overwintering aspects. So a considerable amount of waterfowl, of course, are breeding in the northern parts of North America, especially what we refer to as that orange area known as the Prairie Pothole region, a series of extensive wetlands and lakes and rivers and so forth that are very important in waterfowl breeding and production. And the Southeast benefits from those, where a lot of these birds are coming down to overwinter, looking for good habitats when they do so. In fact, if you look at Florida and some banding data for waterfowl, you can see there the percentages of where those birds started from before their arrival to Florida, especially within that Prairie Pothole region. Florida, of course, has a a long legacy of wetlands. If you drive anywhere in Florida, you're going to see water. In fact, as of 2010, about 11 million acres of wetlands. That ranks us first in the lower 48 in terms of percentage of land surface being wetland. But you can see a little bit of sad part of the story there. When Florida became a state in 1845, it had roughly twice as many acres at the time. So lots of wetland destruction, but also alterations and other forms of ways that we can violate wetlands, including this landscape we're going to be talking about today. But 90% of the wetlands are freshwater, as we'll be looking at today, with the remaining 10% marine estuarine. And interesting part of the story there, it's about 50-50 in terms of public and private ownership of wetlands in Florida. So DU works a lot with public landowners as well as private ones. And we'll be talking about forested and non-forested wetlands, more on that in a moment. We'll show you some pictures. As Kathy mentioned, the funding for this restoration project is coming through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which ultimately comes through NOAA of the federal government, and specifically coming from the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, which is another fancy way of saying the Deepwater Horizon oil spill money. It's about 21.3 million total for this grant. The funding will be used for various aspects. As you can see the list there, the design and permitting, which Wood environmental consulting firm is helping us put together. And that's based on a hydrologic model that FWC paid for in the past. We'll also have imperiled species report that Wood put together. Very important that we consider some of the imperiled species involved. The bulk of the cost will go toward construction, as you can imagine. But then other aspects, monitoring and adaptive management. So we have to define success on the project and define some performance measures and make sure we're doing good things with the money. In ways that we're not meeting success, then we have to adaptively manage. And so that's where that term comes in. So we have money set aside, so to speak, that if we're not meeting the targets we've set, that we can make some adjustments to make sure that we do and provide good product. And some of the money goes to our DU staff time, both engineering, biology staff like myself, and administration of the grant funds. So as I mentioned, the restoration design as it stands at the moment, which is still a work in progress, is largely based on hydrologic modeling. And one of the key features of that modeling effort was to look at the topography. And so this is an image of referred to as LIDAR, so it's laser from fixed wing aircraft, and it gives you pretty tremendous abilities to look at topography. And as you can see, there's quite a range on the site, roughly 30-ish feet of topography within this landscape. But as you can imagine, this is very important for us as we consider flow across the landscape and coming up with a design that's most beneficial and really giving us the most bang for the buck. We don't have enough money to take out every ditch and really wouldn't need to do so. You get to the point of diminishing returns at times as you're planning these sorts of things. And so it's a matter of prioritizing those areas that are in most need of restoration that will give us the most benefit. And a second approach to that hydrologic modeling was to put data loggers within the landscape. And so the yellow marks that you see on the map there are Campbell Scientific data loggers. There's a picture of one there. So these are very important in collecting data about water level or stage on the landscape. FWC also added a few more, which has been terrific to have a nice suite of data collection happening across the landscape. So here's a picture of Kathy, hard at work, downloading one of those FWC units. So these will remain in the landscape and be useful for us as we define our performance measures and monitor the progress. So this hydrologic model is put together by Wood. Takes into consideration lots of things. And firstly, what you see, the red line there is the north boundary of MK. And as you'll notice, the model incorporates aspects to the east and to the west of this project area, because this is all hydrologically connected as a landscape. but it's looking at topography and flow and existing channels and streams and so forth. So lots of things that go into building one of these models. So once again, we'll look from the broader landscape at the site. And as Kathy pointed out, the hydrologic model was instrumental in showing us that the predominant flow historically from the river was from that northeast to the southwest direction. And so we're going about our design from that perspective. And as you mentioned, it's a highly modified landscape, and the ranch itself is about 6,300 acres, but it has about 55 miles of ditches and roads and embankments in it. And what we discovered in this design process is that if we focus our attention on about 533 acres of those changes, man-made changes, then we're going to get the most benefits. And we'll get about 5,800 acres of hydrologic benefit from focusing on that. So as you can imagine, we went through this prioritization process, and what we discover is, given that predominant flow from right to left on your screen there, it's those north-south ditches, the ones shown in red, that are of most interest to us in the way of being obstructions to flow. So no surprise there, those fell out in our prioritization of design. And just one more thought on how wet this landscape is. This is a shot from the National Wetlands Inventory Mapper, a really useful tool online if you've never played with it. But anything in green is wetland. So as you can see, this is an extremely wet area. There's MK shown in red, the bulk of it, of course, being green. The darker green is forested wetland, and the lighter green is non-forested wetland. And we'll look at some pictures of those. As Kathy mentioned, looking back in history with things like aerial photography is especially useful. In some places in Florida, you can have really nice aerials back to the 1930s. And in some cases, some very detailed maps from the 1850s that have been very helpful for us when it comes to doing restoration in Florida. And that's often, something we struggle with when we're trying to restore an area. How far back in history are we going to go? Here where I work a lot in St. Lucie County, Florida, we don't want to go as far back as maybe the 1850s because we have mosquito bite rates of about 250 bites a minute. So I don't think we want to go that far back maybe. But again, it's very useful for us to look back in history and make these determinations. And as she pointed out, this was a very wet property. So if you notice the date on that map, this is January of 1953, and there's a lot of standing water in the central part of MK where all of those ditches now exist. So lots of folks who grew up in the region, including Anita and others, have told me that this was a very important waterfowling spot for hunters. And that's no surprise. So as we consider restoration here, we consider what it used to look like. It used to be very wet. So a little more detail on the habitats that Kathy introduced to us. The bulk of the site is that sort of lime green colors known as floodplain swamp with a fair amount of bottomland forest as well. Pretty similar habitats, the two, honestly. And then the more southern part of the property has a lot of floodplain. Oops, sorry, let's just say marsh, not swamp. And then some mesic flatwoods, mesic being medium, so medium in terms of how wet they are. And the top three there are all wetlands. As Kathy mentioned, things like low water crossings are an important part of this. So now we're at the northern part of the property on the main access road known as Saul's Creek entering the site. So here's a day where the water is very low and we're able to easily access these. We'll be improving some of these in terms of the ground, making it more stable with geotextile and so forth, so that vehicles can easily pass through these areas, but only when the water level cooperates. So in this area, we're looking at some bottomland forest, lots of bays and oaks and certain pines and so forth that are associated with this habitat type. Here's a picture of one of the major crossings that occurs. There's a bridge associated with this one. Gives you an idea of what this habitat looks like. And here's an example of a site where we'll be creating a new low water crossing, where we believe we need one as a result of all of this hydrologic design. And this is where Salts Creek Road dead ends into that bottomland forest. So very, very beautiful community and a very important one on the landscape here. So for floodplain swamp, it's a mix of pond cypress and bays and various maples and water oaks and so forth. So here's a shot from the north end of the property during the winter when the cypress trees have lost their leaves. And as you can see, the foreground there is a very large canal that just doesn't belong in the landscape, right? This was one of the canals that was created as a result of all this that happened in the 1970s. So what I'm standing on as I'm taking this picture is the berm created by that dredging. And so part of the restoration effort is to completely take down some of these berms, push them back into the ditch. So here's an example of the south end of the property, also in floodplain swamp, very large ditch there. And then in the central part of the property, the floodplain swamp grades into the floodplain marsh, and that's where you start to see ditches like these. And you know, one aspect of it that we'll have to deal with is presence of water hyacinth and exotic invasive species here. So we've talked with FWC about doing some aerial treatment with helicopter to knock back these as best we can prior to the restoration effort. But here's an example of a performance measure that we'll want to consider. We certainly wouldn't want to put more of this within the landscape as a result of the project. And now we get into the floodplain marsh. So we're really in the central and southern part of the property at this point. And really is a textbook, beautiful example of a floodplain marsh. So it's mostly made up of grasses or herbaceous plants, as we would say, and as opposed to woody species, willow, cypress, and wax myrtle, which you can see. You'll see a few scattered trees in there, but for the most part, woody species don't do too well in sites like this because of the water level. So this is one of the lowest portions of the property. We can tell that by the plant community, and also by the lidar we looked at earlier, and some beautiful flowering ground cover in here, much like the wet prairie that Kathy showed us earlier. But here's an example of the road that cuts through that floodplain marsh. And in this case, there's a canal on both sides of the road. So in order to raise it up to make a functional road part of the year, they had to draw from two areas within the marsh. So that here's a good example of a road that will mostly disappear as a result of this restoration project. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there's some mesic flatwood on the site in pockets made of pines and hardwoods. So when it comes to the design, of course, eventually we come up with engineering drawings. So here's an example of a sheet created by Wood for us. We're at about 70% design at this point, so we're getting really close to being done with the design. But you'll see some key features there. Now we're in that central area that has the greatest extent of ditching. And what we're looking to do there, you'll see some really dark bars and what we call ditch plugs. So those are areas where we want to completely plug the ditch so that water will go around those sites. You'll see some squiggly lines in places referred to as land smoothing. So that's where we're completely pushing ditch embankment rather into the ditch to really give us that historic elevation landscape. You also see on the top right there sort of a squiggly little line that's an old road and ditch that will be completely removed as part of the project. But I don't know about you, but me as a biologist, I look at this and I get cross-eyed and don't really understand what's going on. So what I did is try to project this into Google Earth, and so I could sort of get a better understanding of what it is we're going to be up to. So we'll start at the north end of the property there. And what you'll see on the right side is we're going to be improving or creating low water crossings within Salts Creek Road. And then I created a red line there, which follows one of the main ditches that runs north-south. And whenever we see a red line on the next series of pictures, what that means is there's alternating spots where we'll be doing ditch blocks or land smoothing. So it won't be a contiguous amount of work throughout those, but it'll be patchy work that we'll be doing. And as we work to the central part of the property. You start to see quite a few more of those. The red lines, again, those alternating ditch plugs and land smoothing. The blue blocks being just ditch plugs and the yellow squiggles being additional land smoothing. So it gives you an idea of those areas that were prioritized. And then there's our road to be removed there, shown in purple. And then lastly, at the south end, more of the same. So the point here is that going through this hydrologic modeling process, we were able to clearly identify the best bang for the buck. The places that were most important, that gave us the most benefit hydrologically if we were to go into the landscape and make these alterations. As I mentioned, we're still at 70% design, so still mulling this over, but wanted you to see where we are at the present time. Another feature, as I mentioned, is doing monitoring and adaptive management. So that's what MAM stands for. We have to come up with a plan for NIFWIF. So we're designing that now. So here's some performance measure metrics we're really focusing in on. Obviously, water stage and flow are going to be very important to us to measure as we understand the pre and post situation here. So water quality aspects like turbidity and dissolved oxygen we feel are going to be important. Avian resources, as Kathy mentioned, they're already doing some bird monitoring on the site. So we'll take full advantage of that. Oops, sorry. And be able to look pre and post at those resources. But then lastly, perhaps most importantly, it's looking at vegetation resources. And there's some consideration for exotic species like hyacinth, but for the most part, it's native species that we're looking at, which is really helpful in this landscape. As I mentioned, we have to develop some adaptive management strategies, and that we've done at the landscape as well as sub-basin scale. So in terms of vegetation, we consider all the tools available to us now. Thankfully, we live in a day and an age when we can use some really nice cutting-edge technologies in the realm we refer to as the remote sensing world. So here's an example of South Florida. I work quite a bit in this landscape. And these are satellite photographs that they were able to consider the vegetation in the past and what it looks like now as they plan for the future. And of course, this is all related to SERP, Comprehensive Vegetation Restoration Plan, the largest attempted restoration plan in human history. And then here's another example of using satellite imagery. So here we're looking at some of the Florida Keys and the effects of Hurricane Irma that passed by in 2016. So you can see very big changes that happened in terms of the vegetation there. But this gives you that very high view, being a satellite, of course. And some of the satellites in Florida, for example, the ones that go over MK Ranch, you can get imagery once a week with the new Landsat, except that cloud cover, is trouble. But a way to get a little closer to the ground and get spatially more fine-grained is to use drones. And so this is what we're leaning toward at the moment. We're going to be putting a bid package together very soon on this to send it out for consulting services. And when we talk about using drones, there's basically two types of cameras, the RVG, which is red, blue, green, and that's what we call true color, right? But then there's multispectral, which includes some of the wavelengths that we cannot see with the naked eye. And what the multispectral in particular allows us to do is look at specific signatures. So if you look at the different colors there on the upper left of the same site repeated, what you'll see is certain features that come out as different colors depending on the wavelength of color. And what's interesting about that is it's possible to classify things in this manner. So when you get to the multi-layering aspect of all of this multispectral imagery, you get to the photograph on the bottom left, which is showing us different plant types. So we focus there on the center, the ones that are sort of yellowish in color, those might all be the same species. So if you can get to the point where you can classify things in that manner, that really helps you to distinguish. And it really gives you a wonderful tool for pre versus post restoration analyses, and that's our goal here. So what we'll be looking at is specific vegetative indices, and you see some listed there. But really, what we're mostly interested in is woody versus herbaceous. So trees and shrubs versus grasses and flowers. because that is going to be the bulk of what is going to be changing in this landscape. So our goal is to do pre-construction monitoring this spring, with the hope that construction will start in the fall. And the construction effort is going to take several years. So then we would do a post-analysis in spring of 2024 and be able to make a comparison. And ground elevation, to some degree, helpful here. You can tease out some of that in some cases if there's not too much vegetation or standing water. But also canopy height is going to be very interesting to us as part of this analysis. So the height of the trees or the grasses and how they change over time. And just here's an example of that 3D imagery that's created. A lot of mathematics behind this. I won't pretend that I understand it all. That's one of the reasons why we're going to be using some outside consulting services in order to get this done. But that's what we're thinking in the way of the vegetation monitoring. And just for scale, for the uninitiated, you cannot fly a drone by law unless you can see it. And that gives you about a 1,500 foot sight radius. So there's an example of what 1,500 foot would be within our landscape there. So as you can imagine, we were able to do transects, so to speak, belt transects using this radius. That would be about 15 to 20 acres each. So we're going to be looking to do some of these transects with the drone in areas that are going to be receiving the greatest changes as a result of the project. But Kathy did a wonderful job of showing us that this particular property is really important in terms of its landscape context. Lots of public lands, lots of wetlands around it, lots of watershed issues happening here. And one important aspect of that is the ongoing monitoring that's happening. So there's a new USGS gauge there along the Jackson River just south of the property. There are some new data loggers that have gone into Lake Wimico as well as the existing data loggers that are upstream in the Apalachicola River. So what we like to think is all this data we're going to be collecting in the landscape is going to be important to feeding into all of this collective knowledge of what's happening within this watershed. And I'll leave you with a couple of more things. One of the most useful tools that I find with my job in understanding effects of projects on our avian communities is eBird. So this is for you bird nerds out there, and that's a term of endearment. A lot of my colleagues are, and I'm slowly becoming one after being a fish guy for my career. But terrific website, and what it allows you to do is look at surveys that have been done voluntarily by folks who input their data into this system. And what you can see there is I've queried great blue heron, real common bird, wading bird here in Florida, and you can see just a tremendous amount of hits. So everywhere you click on one of these, you'll see at least one survey. The red ones are going to be multiple surveys where they've had lots of documentation. So the next slide here is there's our property, by the way. So I don't know of any surveys that have been done on the site aside from the ones that Kathy and her crew have done, and I don't find those in eBird necessarily. But the next one I'll show you is redhead. So these are our ducks that are very common in this region. And so what I've done is I clicked on one of the red ones down there on St. George Island, and you'll see some interesting data. For example, December of 2016 of this past year, Susan Talbert, she got to see 800 redheads in that area. So very interesting way to look at bird data. And my hope is that there may be some folks that are interested in maybe assisting us with some bird surveys there on MK Ranch itself. So here's another shot to give you some context that wading bird rookery is important in the area. Kathy's team will help monitor those by helicopter every year. So we imagine a lot of wading bird benefits to this project. And there you can see red cockaded woodpecker nests as well, and eagle nests. So really important area for a lot of the imperiled species. And as we look to the future, our goal, of course, is to make these areas as resilient as possible. Coastal resiliency is a really important consideration for much of what we do these days. So this is a very interesting tool that NIFWIT put together called the CREST tool. And sadly, it shows you that sea level rise happens as projected, places like MK, are going to transition into other things. So what we want to do is prepare these areas as much as we can, as best we can, for that. And if they're going to transition into estuarine marshes and perhaps seagrass beds, depending on the timing of this sea level rise and so forth, we want to prepare them as best we can. So the best way that you do that is to make them as robust and resilient as possible today. And as Kathy mentions, we have lots of protected species to be considered here as part of this. So here are the key ones that are federally listed. I've also mentioned this. There are some state listed wading birds I think are going to really benefit from this. But of course, we believe also waterfowl will as well. And then there are some of the flowering plants. We don't put up maps of some of these rare species, as we kind of like to keep those to ourselves. But here's an example of a beautiful plant, Florida skullcap. So hopefully get to see some of these things out there as a result of this project. All right, well, again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for having us. And there's my contact information. I'll also put in a shameless plug for a commercial here that DU now has a license plate in Florida that helps us raise funds and do what we do. At this point, we need 3,500 folks to sign up to say that they want the tag in order for it to happen. And so I'll just throw that out there that that would be terrific if anyone's interested in doing that. But also that we rely very heavily on members and volunteers. And so I ask you consider being part of us in that regard. But also, if you're interested in volunteering on the site, especially if you have skills with bird identification and so forth, we'd love to hear from you and help us be a part of this. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. And Kathy, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions. Let's see. Kennedy, if you want to help me get them off mute. Beth Wright was first, then Lynn, then Jim Waddell. Let's see.
Beth, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself, you're welcome to start talking and ask your question.
Beth, can you unmute yourself?
We'll go on to someone else and check back with Beth in a little bit. Oh,
Here
there
I
she
am.
is.
I'm
There
here.
she-
I was outside actually. I'm leaving, getting ready to leave on a trip and trying to watch this at the same time. I was just wondering about the spraying in the marsh. That really disturbs me because you're going to destroy amphibian populations there if you do that, and they've probably never even been surveyed. And we have some state listed salamanders, federally listed, I think. Flatwood salamanders, they wouldn't be in the marsh, but they might be nearby. And also invertebrates. I would think very hard about spraying. I know water hyacinth is awful, but at the very least, someone needs to do an amphibian survey before you do it. And it could kill off invertebrate populations, which could take away invertebrates that ducks eat. So that's all I have to say. Just think hard
Okay,
about it.
thank you. Jim Waddell, did you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks to all for your efforts in putting together the presentation. Just real quick, a little bit of background. Very interested in the project in the area, being a native of Apalachicola, and probably, I guess, going on 25 years now, volunteer with DU, including being an area chairman for a local chapter of Lake Ammonia. So it's, we've always, growing up down there, we always heard about this MK Ranch area. I was fortunate enough, I guess, maybe 20 years ago to be part of a lease that hunted that for waterfowl. And I guess I learned something today, because I would have never guessed in a million years that the historic flow of that region would have been perpendicular to the river and away from the bay. I guess it's sort of gravitates to the lake to get in, and then in order to get there. So I was curious on the modeling that was done by Wood and funded by FWC, what circa or what period LIDAR topography was used in that pre-development model?
Yes, I can answer that. Hey, Jim, thanks for your question. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
No, most counties have fairly good LIDAR for various reasons. Unfortunately, the LIDAR was not especially robust and useful, the existing data set that we knew about. So we asked Wood to refly it, and they used a subcontractor called Atlantic Group to do so. And I think it was 2019 or 20 when that was done. So very, very recently. The modeling for data collected within the landscape from the data loggers, incidentally, was 2016-17. So
is that LIDAR data in the public domain now or no?
I don't know. That's a good question. I can check on that for you.
Okay.
Shoot me an email and that'll help me.
Okay. And then sort of, I guess a related question, but it's I probably already know the answer. I've heard rumor or talk that the barge canal over towards Port St. Joe they're talking about maybe plugging that at some point in the future. Does anyone know if that's still on the table?
Jeff may not know about that, but the status it's at now, as the Northwest Florida Water Management District has installed some flow meters, and I don't know if they're associated with the 9 that have gone in for this project, but I'm sure all the data will be available. But I think they're totally separate projects. The closing off the canal is more of an effort from Gulf County.
Mm-hmm.
Unless anybody else has any other information.
Yes, to clarify very quickly, Anita, the 9 CTDs that I mentioned that went into the lake were put in by Northwest Florida and are not associated with the project, this particular project. So they may very well be, part of their design for what you've just mentioned.
Yeah. And then Kent Smith had a question also. Kent, you want to unmute yourself?
Ed. Yes, yeah, actually. Hey, Jeff, great presentation you and Kathy did. I'm sorry I came in a little bit late, so this may have been covered, but I just wanted to get some clarification on this. So this area used to, it ponded, but during really wet times, it sheet flowed into that, canal, and obviously the water moved to Lake Wimico and tidally back down into the bay system at times. But I know there's a berm around the southern reach of the MK project, and there's some culverts that allow connectivity there. Are there any plans to create more sheet flow type, more of a sheet flow type environment associated with the restoration?
Yes, absolutely, Kent. Good hearing from you. Glad you could make it today. In general, the goal here is to recreate sheet flow as much as possible across the landscape. The southern end has been probably our biggest point of debate when it comes to dealing with the modifications of the landscape. Part of the problem there being to access the site. Do you attack by land or by sea if you're going to try to get into some of those areas? But what we discovered through the modeling effort was doing large-scale changes at the very southern end really don't give you that much in the way of benefit. Because of that prevailing flow that needs to be reestablished from northeast to southwest, we targeted more in the center of the property, for example. But what you can do with the hydrologic model is actually look at each node and each little ditch individually to see pre and post benefits. So it's a really slick tool.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're getting on to 4 o'clock. I wanted to once again thank Kathy and Jeff for a wonderful insight into this restoration. And thank you, Kennedy, for your technical expertise. And wanted to invite everybody to come to our next Sci Cafe, which will be April 29th at 3 p.m. And we'll talk about the Oyster Corps, a new division of the Conservation Corps of the Forgotten Coast. And we're starting an oyster shell recycling program, so you might want to tune in for that. All right, well, thank you all.